everybody, it's Joe Parr, founder of the Ladies Working Dog Group. Are you feeling stuck with your gun dog training? Trust me, you're not alone, and that's exactly why you need to be here. Every week, we're bringing you the best tips and hacks to make training your gun dog easy peasy. We'll keep it straightforward, no fuss, just actionable guidance that you can put straight to use. So let's get started. Hello and welcome to another episode of Found It, Fetched It. This week we are going to be talking to Lottie Clinch all about her journey to the heart of the Countryside Alliance. How are you today, Lottie?
I am very well, thank you. Glad to see the sun is shining.
I'm really interested in this conversation because a lot of our listeners might have heard of the Countryside Alliance. They might be aware of the organisation, but they might not be really understanding of what you do. But before we get on to your career, let's start with what ignited your love for field sports.
So I am one of these people who hasn't been born into a family living and breathing field sports. I segued into field sports through my love of horses initially, and also through some really positive influences in my life, particularly my great aunt, Gilly. So I moved down to Sussex from Yorkshire when I was about 7 or 8 years old. And everybody at my school was dancing. But when I moved to Sussex, everybody did horse riding. That was the thing. And fast forward 10 years later, I was an absolutely avid equestrian and I was eventing a lot. But then I had to move to university and sell my horse. And when I decided to get back into riding, I took up hunting. That was my sport of choice because it didn't require quite the commitment of eventing, but still meant that I could keep myself in the saddle. And at that time, I had lots of friends who were into shooting and fishing. And I was just very lucky that friends and boyfriends took me under their wing, and I just fell in love with the sports. When you grow up in a rural community, most people or most teenagers who have an interest in the countryside fall in love with beating. And that was the same for me. When I was in secondary school, I was beating fairly regularly, and then you just get to know people. And like I say, I've been lucky that people have taken me under their wing and shown me the way. So through hunting, I then fell into shooting a bit, and then through shooting, I fell into fishing. And now here I am with a firearms license, a shotgun license, a couple of rods. No longer horses, but I think that's hopefully temporary. But my love of shooting and fishing really came from my great aunt, like I touched on. I was lucky enough that in 2020, at the age of 83, my great aunt decided to hang up her cartridge bag and very kindly gifted me her Old English side-by-side. So that was the first gun that I ever had for myself. And I started shooting with that only as early as 2020. So we're not talking a long time ago. And then from that, again, I got into clay shooting and then into game shooting.
Isn't it funny, you're the second person now that I've spoken to in probably the last couple of months who has touched upon how a great aunt or grandmother has got them into this sport. And we talk quite a lot about the female's role in the countryside, but these ladies were the pioneers for us, weren't they? They were out doing what was definitely, without doubt, seen as a man's sport.
And I think it's a really interesting concept still today that shooting or fishing or stalking, is a man's sport, because we have so many photos and pictures of women historically being involved in these sports and recreations and lifestyles. And yeah, I think it is really interesting that it's great to see now women doing it more. But the idea that women weren't already doing it is an interesting one, because they definitely were. We just don't talk about it as much. So it's nice to see that we share that a bit more now.
Absolutely. So you've got quite an interest in quite a range of different field sports, because sometimes people are very much one of those categories. To cross a lot of those categories, that's slightly more unusual, isn't it?
Yeah, so I am a true jack of all trades and master of none. I don't pretend to be particularly good at any of them, but truly I love them. So for me, I was lucky enough to be introduced to stalking And for me, I think that's my real passion. I think it comes down to the sustainability element of it as well. And for me, it also gives me a huge amount of headspace, which is really important. So don't get me wrong, absolutely love nothing more than walking around rough shooting with my shotgun and having a laugh with friends. That is the joy of game shooting for me. But stalking just gives me something a little bit different. And I think it's the solitude. And I think it's also that kind of process of harvesting a wild animal from start to finish and doing the gralloch and the butchery. I don't shoot great numbers of deer, but most of the deer that I do shoot end up in either my fridge or freezers of friends. And I think that's what's a really nice part of it for me, is that hobby side of it that you can share with other people. And when it's like a really frosty, cold November morning and you're sat in a high seat and you're watching the world come awake, nothing beats that for me. Like that is what I love. But that said, I was lucky enough that me and a couple of friends took on the lease to a little small rough shoot this season for the first time, which was just so much fun. And going out and feeding the birds and doing it ourselves and introducing friends to our little patch and to come out with us. And we don't get big bags, but just to be able to share that with friends was great fun as well. So I think it's the camaraderie of field sports that's really lovely too. But I have been lucky to be mentored really well by some very kind, generous people, and that has been a massive privilege.
So, who accompanies you dog wise on your field sport adventures?
Sprout and Bramble are my two tearaway tackles. They are firmly on the lead, but they do come everywhere with me. I've got a great photo actually of Sprout fishing with me when he was a tiny puppy and he zipped into the front of my coat and I'm throwing a cast out and you can just see his little nose poking out, which is very sweet. So yeah, Sprout and Bramble come everywhere with me. They've been stalking with me, they've been on shoots with me, they've been fishing. I even have, photos of Sprout on the front of the saddle with me out on hunt rides. So yeah, they very much come everywhere. They are companions.
Moving on from your love of dogs and of your tackle, tell us a little bit more. So you mentioned earlier that you went to university. Did you go to university to do anything countryside related?
Not at all. So I did a law degree. So I moved to London in 2013, did a 3-year degree in law, and had a place to do my bar exams, thought I was going to be a barrister, and then took a year out to figure out what I was going to do. And I actually ended up in banking. And again, you know how life goes, you just follow this sort of strange segue. And by the end of lockdown, I was working for HSBC and I was back in London. And this must have been 2021 now. And I was just couldn't figure out what it was that I wanted to do with my life. I'd figured out this kind of toss up, or was constantly caught in a toss up between having this secure job, but also finding my calling or working for a cause that I really cared for. And a job came up at the Countryside Alliance. I had been a member of the Countryside Alliance since I was a teenager to obviously insure me for my hunting and shooting, mostly hunting actually back then. I wasn't shooting when I was a teenager, but I was obviously beating and hunting. And I just thought that would be a really interesting opportunity to go and work for an organization that not only had I been a member of myself for a long time, but also one that I really cared passionately about. And obviously, the Countryside Alliance is the political campaigning organization on behalf of the countryside. We very much see ourselves and our members see us as the voice of the countryside. So we do all of the advocacy and lobbying and campaigning on behalf of rural communities when it comes to legislation and policy in the devolved nations as well as our own central government and in Europe as well.
So a lot of our listeners might be like, so you've explained a little bit of what the Countryside Alliance does there, but a lot of people might think, oh, isn't there other organizations that does this? Or I didn't know Countryside Alliance existed. There are not people who do different parts of it, but you all work in collaboration, don't you? But you all got
Absolutely.
your own agendas.
Absolutely. And the aim to sustain partnership is obviously a big part of that. And that sees all of the similar organizations come together. But in many ways, we have very similar attributes, but we also are quite distinct. And I think our distinction really comes from that political campaigning and the public relations that we do. I think that is what sets us apart from similar organizations. The Countryside Alliance doesn't offer discounts on 4x4 tires or discounts in shops, because for us, we wouldn't want to compete with other organizations on that. Our value and the value that our members come to us for really is in that political representation.
When your newsletter hits my inbox, I stop and I read, because I always feel like the important topics are discussed, and they're discussed in depth. I get a better understanding of what's going on politically in field sports.
Yeah, and I think that's great to hear. And I think that definitely is where we set ourselves apart from other organizations. The subject matter experts that we have and that I have the privilege of working with is amazing. And that is one of our best member benefits, I would say, is that a member can pick up the phone and speak to a subject matter expert and be able to get that political insight on policy and legislation that potentially they wouldn't be able to get elsewhere, or they would struggle to find on the internet. And that is where our value is.
What we haven't touched upon yet is your role in the Countryside Alliance. So what is it that you do?
So my job title is Chief of Staff and Operations, and that is a kind of broad role that goes some way to explaining what I do day to day. So one side of my role is obviously the operational side. So I look after our membership team and our events team. So events, shows, and our front-facing membership team fall under my umbrella. We've got a great team who, listening to them on the phones and talking to members, it's just wonderful. They are so dedicated and brilliant at what they do. And then, of course, we have our events and shows. And I took that over at the back end of last year. So this year really is my opportunity to get my teeth into the shows and events that we do. So you'll see us at badminton, at the game fair, at the Festival of Hounds, and there are a few smaller shows too. But I think what's really exciting is that for me, I'm starting to look at our strategic partnerships more. So our affiliations with other organisations, similar to the Ladies Working Dog Group, and seeing what more we can do with partnership organisations. The other side of my role is obviously the internal operations, so the kind of engine room of our employees and employee welfare and our internal policy. So the slightly less sexy side of how organisations run, that also falls to me too.
It's really fabulous talking to you though, because I'm always intrigued with how people start in one place and then end up in another, because I certainly never ever in my career forecasting saw me running the Ladies Working Dog Group. It just was never even remotely on my horizon. It's like you just said, it just happens. So looking back over your career and starting out in law, where you are now, they're very different places, aren't they?
There are, but I think there's definitely skills that I've learned that have helped me. And obviously things like writing internal policies or reviewing employee contracts, like all those sorts of things are relevant to the studying that I've done. And I think also my degree has taught me to be strategic in thinking, and internal strategy and commercial strategy for the organizations that I've worked for. That's really what I love to look at. So it depends. And obviously I've had a history in finance and banking too. So it all starts to weave in. You don't necessarily see it at the time, but with hindsight, you can think, oh yeah, I picked up this skill doing that. And that job that I did then has really taught me an awful lot. So yeah, it doesn't necessarily seem like a natural progression to go from a law degree to working for the Countryside Alliance, but it feels right to me.
Yeah, and I agree with you on that. If I look at the jigsaw pieces that make up my role now, every single role before has helped or has been pivotal part of that, of understanding, like my teaching qualifications and things like that. What I do now, coaching, mentoring, you find yourself pulling on those all the time. My understanding of certain things. Do you think in your role now, have you got plans for not changing the amount of events, but what's your plans for like member facing? What can we look forward to seeing from the Countryside Alliance?
So something that is a new initiative is we've brought out more membership options in terms of the junior memberships. We're really trying to create a more of a following with that youthful engagement. So I can't say too much at the moment, but we have got plans in place, hopefully that we're rolling out in May. But also just connecting with that younger audience is really important to us as we go forward, that they are going to be the ones that safeguard our way of life and our hobbies for the future generations. So they're really key to us in connecting with them. We are reaching out to agricultural universities, and hopefully you will see us at the Freshers' Fairs for those. So yeah, we're having a real push in terms of our youth engagement.
Because for you, your youth engagement in the Countryside Alliance is what made you want to work for them, I'm assuming.
Yeah, I joined the Countryside Alliance as a teenager, so I have a real personal investment in maintaining that relationship with teenagers. And in a world where people don't sign up to memberships in the same way, we have to be really creative in the way that we're looking at sustaining our future as the Countryside Alliance, how we ensure that we stay relevant and that people still see the value in supporting us and helping us to help them, really. And for me personally, I think that's not to in any way discredit our older members, but I think it is really important that we continue to be considered valuable by a younger generation.
The reality is, it's the younger generation that will ultimately decide the future of field sports, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. And a lot of that comes down to education too. So ensuring that the younger generations are equipped and understand the way things work and the way we do the things that we do, and why it's so important that we have the internal, what's the word I'm looking for? We manage our field sports in a way that's credible internally to stop any more external intervention in terms of policy and legislation. So if we can be seen to be credible and be well-run organizations, and that the sports are well-run and sustainable, if we can teach that to the younger generations, then hopefully that should help to safeguard them for the future.
Yeah, I think you're quite right. Like, speaking to what is now Eat Wild with bees, this massive need for us to self-regulation, isn't it? It's like saying, like, look, we don't need you to get involved because we understand the problems ourselves. We're not glossing them over. We are addressing them. We are addressing the sustainability. We are addressing the ethics of what we do.
Absolutely.
I spoke about this the other day with a lady on podcast. We cannot have any more 1,000 bags where they are dumped. And people will say it doesn't happen. It does happen. We all know it happens. There's evidence of it. It cannot happen. It's not happening across the board. And that's the worst thing, isn't it? It's not the good shoots. It's not the well-run, established places. It's a minority who will make the rest of us look bad.
And the trouble is that you can apply that across field sports in general. You can apply it to all sports, field sports particularly, because of the nature of what we do. And I think we have to be realistic about, in order to be seen to be credible and believable, we have to have some seriously credible self-regulation in place. And that can be applied to fishing, to shooting, to hunting, whatever. It's about having the social license to be able to continue doing what we do. And that social license depends on credible self-regulation. And that's why we might bang on about things like the Code of Good Shooting Practice, but it's really important, because if we can't evidence that we're doing things sustainably and credibly and ethically, then we have to question why we're doing it. We have to be honest with ourselves whether we really believe that there is a future for our sports. And I really believe there is, but it has to be best practice. We have to be absolutely sharp, and there has to be a zero tolerance policy, because, like you say, it only takes one minority to discredit the well-behaved majority. So everybody has to get on board. And it's also just the right thing to do. Privileged to be able to do the sports that we do and live in a world that allows us to. And it is a responsibility. It's not a given that we just get to have guns and that we just get to take fish and that we shoot animals. It has to be done in a way that is justifiable and credible. So yeah, that's really important. And education's a huge part of that.
I think, like you, I grew up fox hunting, and I think the one challenge we had, even understanding why we were doing it and what our thought processes were behind it, was the fox was never eaten at the end of it, if that makes sense. With what we do with shooting and with fish and with stalking, I think if there is that circle of life where the end kill is then used for meat, not that makes it right for everyone, because it certainly doesn't, but for those who are meat eaters, they can understand and get on board with that process. What people can't get on board with the process is if there is waste at the end.
Yeah, and I think that's why initiatives such as Eat Wild are so important, because we've got to be able to create a market for the game that we shoot. And we know that we have an enormous problem with the overpopulation of deer in this country. And it's just such a no-brainer. It's such a lean protein. It's so readily available. It lives such a wild life. And the challenge for us is being able to persuade the wider public of that and get away from this kind of cuddly Bambi situation. And for me, the idea of eating game is far more palatable if we start from venison. That to me is the easiest win. That's the lowest hanging fruit because it's just such a no-brainer. And I know that game shooting is a slightly different prospect, but I think if we can start to educate the public on why it's the right thing to do in terms of wild meat, then we're making some progress somewhere that's perhaps more palatable than the idea of game shooting.
You go to Tesco's, you go to Marks Spencer's, you can go to Lidl, you can get venison and pheasant products in most of those now, which is great to see because it is introducing a wider market to the fact that these meats are A, delicious, and B, can be part of their daily food input.
Yeah, and I think because we're so involved with it, we probably do take for granted that people don't really understand where their food comes from. And it can be very easy to just call people ignorant. But a lot of people live that way. And it is up to us to be able to, accessible way, explain why shooting a pheasant that's been reared and then eating it is perhaps even more ethical than eating a battery farm chicken. And it's really interesting because when you do polling or research into this, people know that they're hypocritical. People, the general public will know that I know I'm a hypocrite because I eat chicken, but I'm against horse racing, for example. People understand that they're hypocrites. And that really is the challenge, is trying to figure out what it is going to take to have people understand that run shoots with a genuine market for the game that they shoot has got to be as good an option as a farmed chicken, and it's trying to sell that is a challenge.
Yeah, because I don't care what meat it is that any of us pick up. We all hope that the animal that it came from had a basic good level of welfare, that it didn't have a bad life and then get killed, because that bit we don't like. We want them to have been treated well up until the point of dispatch.
Absolutely. And I think that's the idea, is that for me personally, I'm pretty confident that the game that I eat is high welfare, that the welfare of that animal is going to be better than the chicken that I can buy in a supermarket by virtue of the fact that it's been in the wild, it's lived a wild life. And I know that, again, game birds are reared initially, but they then go and live what could be more free range than that. Yeah, it's certainly not an easy task to convince the wider public of that, but I certainly think that the means can justify the ends.
You've certainly only got to go and watch gamekeepers trying to keep birds on shoots to know how wild they are. They literally don't have a fence, do they?
No.
So we can go forward a little bit more. We've talked about politics and quite deep stuff here, but the Countryside Lions, if people join, is it like, oh, it's all going to be politics?
No, so obviously we offer our members insurance in a similar way to lots of other organizations. For us, like I've touched on, the value really is in the media and policy information that we can give. We have contacts, our relationship with the media and our relationship with policymakers and those in the legislative process, I think, is demonstrated, like you say, in our weekly newsletters, in our membership magazine. You really can understand that is our bread and butter. So it's not all boring politics. Hopefully that it is pretty stimulating, but that is the bread and butter of what we do. We are a political campaigning force.
And you are a force, to be fair. Like when I read stuff, I do believe the information I get. Sometimes when you read policy, you're just like, sorry, you lost me at the first sentence because there's about 500 really big words that people don't need to put into that sentence. With your stuff, I feel like I can actually easily read it and actually enjoy it whilst also learning.
That's great. And that's what we're here for. We've got the subject matter expert in terms of the policy, and we're here to represent our members and then to distill that information down. That is what people pay their membership for, is for us to do the legwork on their behalf.
To finish our podcast, thank you so much for doing it, because it has been absolutely fascinating to talk to you, and certainly about your technicals and how you got to where you are and what you do. For people listening, if they wanted to join the Countryside Alliance or find out more about it, how would they do that?
The best thing to do is to visit our website, which is obviously Google Countryside Alliance, and you'll find us. And there you can find our membership team's phone number as well. They're really happy to help, or just give us a call.
Fabulous. Thank you very much for spending your time talking to us today. For our listeners, I hope you really enjoyed. You understand a little bit more about the Countryside Alliance and what they do and how you can get involved and how they can be helpful to you, because that's what most of us want to understand, is what can we join that can help us and help the future that we love. Thank you very much for listening, and we shall see you all next week. That's it for today's episode. A massive thank you for tuning in. Don't forget to head over to the LWDG and sign up for our membership. Get access to expert-led training, a wonderfully supportive community, and the resources you need to become a confident and skilled gun dog trainer. Let's take this journey together, because no woman should have to train her gun dog alone. We'll see you all next week.